In this lecture, we're going to learn about nested classes. And this is a feature we have in C++ to allow us to declare classes inside other classes. If you look here, we have a class called outer, and it is our outer class. But if you look inside the private section here, you see that we have another class declaration, and the class is called inner. So we can set up things like this if it makes sense for our application. And this is really useful if you want to limit how people can create inner objects, and you want them to only be able to do that inside another object. So this is going to become useful, but I personally think this design is really weird and confusing. People are going to have a hard time to really put together the relationship between your classes. But please note that this is my own personal preference if it makes sense for the problem you are trying to solve with C++. Okay, so this is really all about nesting. But before we head over to Visual Studio Code and play with us, let's see some facts about this. When the inner class is private, its objects can't be created from the outside, like in main. If you do that, you're going to get a compiler error because you are trying to access something private to the object. So if you do this, you're going to get a compiler error. The outer class doesn't have access to private members of the inner class. So this is a setup we have, and you're going to have this if you set up inner classes inside outside classes. The inner class is going to have access to private sections of the outer class, so you can access the private member variables, and inner can directly access static members of outer, but it can't access member variables without going through an object name. And these are some limitations you need to be aware of. I realize some of these things might not make sense yet, so we're going to head over to Visual Studio Code and play with this a little more. Okay, here we are in our working folder. The current project is nested classes. We are going to bring in our template files. So let's do that. And we're going to put them in place. And let's open this by dragging and dropping on top of Visual Studio Code here. This is going to open our project. We're going to create two files for the class that we want to create. We're going to create the outer.h file and the outer.cpp file to hold our outer class. So let's do that. We're going to say outer.h. This is the header. And we're going to say outer.cpp. This is going to be our implementation file. I am going to put in my header file information. And what we have is really simple. We have the outer class. We have a public section. We have a private section. Inside the private section, we have a few member variables. We also have a static member variables. And if you go down, you're going to see that we have our inner class inside. And this is nothing complicated, really. It is a simple class. After the declaration of the class, we have to put a semicolon. This is the syntax that C++ expects. And inside our inner function, we have the do something with outer function. And we're going to learn about these little things in a minute when we have put in place the CPP file. Okay, so let's do that. We're going to go to the CPP file and put in the implementation for our class. It is nothing complicated, really. We just have the implementations for our two constructors that we have in our outer class. We have an onParam constructor and we have a constructor that takes two parameters. And we're going to use this two-param constructor to do the work for the no-param constructor here. We are going to delegate. Other than this, this is really simple. We are also going to implement the constructor for inner, and you see that we have to use the syntax like this to say that the inner constructor is living inside the outer class. So you have to do things like this. If you take out this scope resolution operator, you're going to get a compiler error because the compiler is going to look for this in the header, and it's not going to know where to look because it doesn't know where this inner constructor lives. The way to tell the compiler that is to go through the scope resolution operator like this. So this is the first thing you need to know. If we go in our header file, we're going to see that inner has only one constructor that takes one parameter, and that's what we are using here. We are using initializer list to do this. Okay, so let's really look at this a little more. Okay, so now that we have this set up here, let's try to do some things with our inner class. The first thing you might want to do is to create an object of this class. Let's do that. We're going to head over to main CPP and we're going to include outer because that's the header. that contains our things. And we're going to try and go inside and say inner, okay, inner1, let's say that. And we're going to pass a parameter, maybe 5.6. I think that's what this guy takes. Let's check this. Let's see what we take. Yes, we take a double param. And if we try to do this, this is not going to work because the compiler is going to look to the outside in here, and it's not going to see any inner class. We don't have any class called inner declared in the outside scope in the outer.h file here. So it's not going to find it, and we're going to get a compiler error. It's going to say, I don't know what inner is. Let's do that. I'm going to pass this through GCC. You're going to see for yourself. And it's going to say inner was not declared in this scope. We don't know what inner is. So you might think, inner is declared inside another class. What if I use a scope resolution operator? Let's do that. We're going to say outer, and we're going to put a scope resolution operator, and the error is going to change. But you're going to see that it's going to know what inner is. It's going to give us a different compiler error. Let's build and show you that. And it's going to say outer inner is private within this context, because inner lives in the private section of outer. You can see that here. We can't access it from the outside, and that includes trying to create objects from this, because this is going to call the constructor of inner, but the inner constructor is living in the private section of outer. So we can't really access it, and if we do this, we're going to get this compiler error that we are seeing here. You might want to try and come here and make this little guy public. If you do this, this is going to work. So let's do that. We're going to build again and use a GCC to do that. Now this is working, because if you issue a call like this, it's going to search for the constructor for inner. It's going to go in this header file. It's going to search, and it's going to find, I have a constructor here, and I can call it from the main function because it is public, and everything is going to work. Let's see if we have a member function on inner that we can call. Let's say get double, and this is going to print the static int, and we're going to see that printed out on the console. So let's do that. We're going to say get double, and we can say inner1 get double, and we're going to build and see if we can print and see something on the console. Okay, the build is good. We can clear and run rooster, and if we do this, we have our variable, which is 45. If we go in outer, we're going to see that this little guy is 45, and we are accessing that from our member function of the inner class, and this is really cool. Okay, so now you know that if you set up your inner class to be in a private section, you want to be able to use that from the outside by creating objects like we do in here. So you should know that. Another thing I want to bring to your attention is that the outer class here doesn't have access to private members of the inner class. Let's go and see what we can have here. We have inner_var, and inside the do something method of outer here, we have an inner object. We can do that because this is a member function of outer, so it can use the private members of inner. This is not going to give us a problem. But if we try to access a private member from the outer class, we're going to get a compiler error. And outer doesn't have access to private parts of inner. We have to go through setters and getters to do that if you want to access these guys. So this is the message here. Let's try and build, and we're going to see a compiler error. So we're going to see inner_var is private within this context. We can't really access that here. If you do that, you're going to get a compiler error. But you can go through a getter function to have access to whatever you want. So for example, if we go in inner and set up a member function, we can return the member variable from that member function and have access to that inside our do something function here. So for example, we can go down here and say get double and try to print that out. Why not? And we can see the member function called here on top, get double. This is how you can use this. So if we call do something on our outer object that we create, we're going to see this message here. So let's try this out. Let's build and show you that this is working first. And we have a problem. Class outer inner is private. In this context, we can't create objects of outer. So this is the problem we have in main. We can take this out and build again. And before we build, we're going to create an object of outer. So we're going to say outer1, and we're going to give it whatever it wants. Let's see what the constructor of outer is taking. We're going to pass in a nut and a double. Let's do that. We're going to pass in a 10 and a 20.1. Why not? And we can do something with outer. We can say outer one, do something. And if we build, this should build just fine. We're going to use GCC for that. You're going to see that the build is good. We can clear and run Rooster. And I created an inner object with a value of 10. So let's look at this. We're going to see what we have in the constructor. We do something. We create an inner object. We put in a value. And then we're going to print the member variable through a getter that we have here. This is the setup you can use to have access to member variables of your private nested class if you happen to need that in your application. But a nested class is going to have access to private members of the englobing class. And this is going to work if you go through the object names. So let's go down here and really show you that. We have a function called do something with outer, and we pass a pointer to outer. And then we're going to go through this pointer to access the member variables of outer. And we are doing this from the inside of the inner object. And this is going to work. So to be able to try this out, we're going to go in a method that we have in outer, which is going to create our object. And we're going to call the do something with outer method. And we're going to pass this object, because that's going to be the outer object we will be working on. So we're going to do that, and let's comment out all this we had on top here, because it's going to be confusing if we have this. And we're going to see what we see in this call here. So let's build and see that this builds. The build is good. And if we run this, let's do that. We're going to run this, and you see this is inner access private parts of outer mvar is 1, and we're going to see that printed out here. I realize this is really convoluted, but you need to know this if you're going to use nested classes in your design. So we are really accessing a private member of the outer class, which is mvar here, inside an inner class object, and this is going to work. Another thing you should know is that from your nested class, you have access to static members of the englobing class without going through the object name. And we are accessing this static member function here without really going through an object name. And you're going to see that this is going to work. If we try to compile this, this is going to work just fine. Let's use GCC and show you that. And you see that the build is good. So this is really all I have to share in terms of nesting classes inside other classes. Again, these are a few things you need to remember. When inner is private, you can't create objects of inner from the outside. If you do that, you're going to get a compiler error. Outer doesn't have access to private sections of nested classes. If you try to access that, you're going to get a compiler error. But inner has access to the private section of the englobing class. And inner can also directly access static members of the outer class, but it can't access regular member variables which are not static without going through object names. And this is really all you need to know. If you keep these things in your mind, you're going to be able to use nested classes fairly easily in your career as a C++ developer. We are going to stop here in this lecture. In the next one, we're going to try and zoom in on in-class member initialization. Go ahead and finish up here and meet me there.